So chapter 37, Ayin Beis, we begin discourse number 10. Matis Masei, the mimer is called Vayidaber Meshach Resha Matis. And it's on the bottom of page 62, Samach Beis. Friedrich Rebbe, summary for this chapter. Friedrich Rebbe wrote summaries for each chapter. Summary, not just one line. This is what he calls Teichen Hascholas HaMaimer, the content of the beginning of each Maimer. So he writes here, Mailo Mata Ribu Yemiyut Be'etzem Muhuson, which means the hierarchy of above and below, Ribu Yemiyut, which is abundance and more and less, really means here volume, more volume, less volume of energy, but fundamentally. So essentially he's giving us a taste of what's coming. So the review where we're at is like this. We're in the midst of the discussion of the structure of existence, which is fundamentally defined in Hasidic language by Oiris Pnimim, which means internalized, integrated energies. Integrated meaning that the energy is integrated in a container. In the world in which we live, everything is container and energy. You can't convey ideas without words. Words have to be measured exactly to the idea has to be measured exactly to the words. That's the world in which we live. If we lived in a different type of world where we can communicate, we'd mind readers. Even there, the mind also needs some type of form of communication. But in our world, everything consists of at least those dual forces. The energy of the thing and how it's communicated. So basically, Eir and Keli, or soul and body. Nothing does not have those two elements. In the root of it, it's called Eiris and Kelim. That God structured existence in this fashion, that every entity, Chochmah, Bina, Chesed, Gvura, everything literally has those two elements to it. And obviously, the energy in the container are relative to what level you're talking about. So he was discussing at length how these two forces come and are tailored and integrated within one another. And the last mimer, the last discourse, basically was discussed the structure and the hierarchy, how the proportionate ratio between Eir and Keli determines whether something is a higher level or something is a lower level. So besides the fact that it's integrated and that there's these two forces, they also are different. That in Chachma, where their container is very sublime, very ethereal, just a point, the energy is very intense. As the container expands, the energy gets weaker. As he explained that both in the 10 spheres and in the worlds. And the last chapter discussed basically that this does not just come from the container level, this comes from the energy level. Because the kav, how did God so-called craft and fashion the structure? He used a paintbrush. He used a thin ray of light. A thin ray of light that things that are closer to the top of that ray, the top of the kav, are more energy, less container. Lower is more container, less energy. It diminishes as it goes. Similar to the transmission of a teacher to a student to lower students. So as the students' containers are more substantive, meaning that they're less refined, the energy has to be diminished in order for them to receive.
So the container is conveyor the level of the air?
No, this is what he discussed in the last chapter. He says both. It can go either way. The energy could determine with the container, and the container can determine the energy. Usually, the way it begins is the energy first determines. It's the way it measures. In other words, the teacher determines based on the container how the flow should flow. Then, once the container becomes more refined, as he explains, then the container can demand more, so to speak, or he calls it mamshich more. It draws more energy into it. Containers in earth don't work that way. Like, for example, a cup. A cup is a cup forever. A cup doesn't get more refined. A cup meaning not a physical cup. But containers in Lamaila and Ruchni is like a vodim. Think of it this way: a young child, the energy will flow weak. A child is not strong. But as the muscles develop, and as the person develops, the kelim becomes stronger. Exercise will draw more energy. So he says clearly, it can go both ways. But generally it speaks, it begins with the energy. The energy is the measurer, and then the container can initiate, so to speak. And this is, as he said, all Eres Pnimim. This is how Eres Pnimim work. So now we move on to next mimer. At the bottom of page 62. Leidaber Moshe Shabbos Pasha Matis Masei Terav. So this was delivered on Pasha Matis Masei Tafresh Ayin Beis, 1912, that summer. But it was written before. But the beginnings and ends were written. In other words, the actual discourse was written much earlier in one flow. Then when he delivered them, before he delivered them, or whenever, it's not exactly clear, but before he delivered them, he added beginnings and ends fitting to the chapter of that week. Then that's how he delivered it. So the Maimarim were delivered actually mimer by mimer, not as one flow, but he begins with the verse, asks some questions, and then goes back and says, to understand this, we have to preface what we learned, and then continues. So it's a fascinating way of also connecting Kol HaTeira Kula, basically. Because really, at the end of the day, you can write a whole essay just on how every parsha is part of a theme of the whole Ayin Beis, because they all ultimately connect that way, because that's every parsha is like. I just want to add one thing that was not spelled out yesterday. Thank you to you, Cheskel. That at the end of the last discourse, he spoke about the answer of Rosh Chachechem, and he spoke about two Rosh Chachechem, plural. So the Zohar says, a moon only has one Rosh. The sun only has one root, one source. So what's the Rosh? So the Zohar answers Yaakov and Yosef. And with all the different interpretations in Kabbalah, it's Yesod, Teferes and Yesod, Teresh B'Ksav, Teresh B'Alpeh, Yaakov and the Yichud of Yaakov and Rachel, Yichud of Yisrael and Rachel, Teira and Eidos, etc. And Eidos and Nesuyin. He explained all these two levels, and then explained that all these Yichudim, all these both two levels, which is the Yichud essentially of the sun and the moon, is all in the level of Eres Pnimim, internalized, integrated energies, and says there are two types. So it wasn't so clear, we didn't spell out yesterday, but it seems that the connection to actually is the first one is the initial energy. The energy that flows into the containers measures and creates. But as the containers get more refined, there's a thing called taste for sale. That's what Yosef adds. So you could say Yaakov, you could say the first level of the moon receiving from the sun, meaning Malchus receiving from Zah, is the regular transmission that a higher level and gives to a lower level. A mashpia to a makabel, a transmitter to a recipient. But then comes a taste for seir. He says, and this is already, he calls this air atzmi, an essential air, not just a reflection. This is already Yosef. This is the second Rosh, so to speak, the second element, the Primius. And this, and these are the two things. So they're commensurate essentially between, I guess, the two levels where the energy gives to the container and how the container, as it gets more refined, draws from the energy more. That's what was suggested, and I think it's correct. He doesn't spell it out, but it sounds right. Okay. So now we move on to chapter next mimer. And Moshe spoke to the heads of the tribes, the Bnei Yisrael, the Matis, the Bnei Yisrael, meaning the tribes of Israel. Lemer, tell them, this is the thing that you should command, that God commanded. And what is this thing? He's going to talk about Nedarim. It's the mitzvah of Nedarim, vows. All the conditions about when a person will vow, how they vow and how they absolve a vow, etc., etc. What does this mean? This like so-called obscure or vague term. That this is the thing that God commanded. He should have just began being on the daughter. He could have said, Leimer, ish ki yodur, when a man will vow, and all the laws that follow. What's this additional element that says, tell the leaders of the tribes, this is the thing that God commanded, and then begins that when a man will vow, etc., take an oath. Should have just said, what does that add? Zeh hadover. This thing is what God commands. Should have just said, what is this introduction that he first says Zeh hadover? We also understand why was the parsha, this chapter about the mitzvah of nadarim, of vows and oaths, set specifically to the heads of the tribes? Isn't the Torah said? The Torah is said to all Jews. What distinguishes Nadarim, the chapter of Nadarim, that it was said specifically to the heads of the tribes? Two questions. To understand this, we need to preface that which we discussed earlier. The that in the 10 spheres there's a structure, there's a diversity. Hischalkus means a division, but essentially a structure and diversity of Maila Mata. And it's interesting, Hischalkus, Maila Mata are both necessary. You could say Hischalkus, you could have 10 entities, but they could have exactly the same amount of energy and container. So there would be 10 equal entities. Here, they're 10 distinct, but they're also distinguished by higher and lower. Higher and lower we mean in position, in degree. Not necessarily, we're not talking about physical higher and lower. We're talking about in conceptually higher and lower. And the reason for this is that the spheres have this distinction and this structure and hierarchy is because the energies are integrated energies. They're eres premium. That come and manifest within containers. So they have within themselves a measurement, a measure of the method and the way of their transmission and their revelation, that is not equal in all the levels. And this is the inyan, this is what it means, that there's a division, there's a diversity, there's a distinction of higher and lower among them. So defining higher and lower here, see, we talk higher and lower, we would say someone is taller, someone is shorter. 5 feet tall, 6 feet tall. 1 mile long, 2 miles long. In spirituality is the concept, the idea of length and the height, or greatness, or volume, meaning higher and lower, is defined by what he just said. Being that the energy is integrated in the container, the question is how much energy is flowing, and how much is the container receiving. That would define higher, more. If the volume is less, it's lower. That's essentially the way you define it. So therefore you could say that, say, 5 students in a classroom has nothing to do with their height, or with their weight, or with their physical measurements. It's to do with how the flow of energy is entering into each one of them, with the one that's receiving more energy being a higher dimension. Now chapter 37. Lamed Zayin. V'hinei, now, be'inyan ma'ila mata. Now in this thing of ma'ila mata that we've been discussing, above and below, or higher and lower, gradation, in other words, it's saying so as if to say, or in other words, what is called Maila Mata? What means higher and lower? In Mavur b'Mokam it's explained elsewhere that this is in the level of ribuy amiyut, more and less. Maila Mata means more and less, as I just translated. Seemingly that's what he said till here. Obviously he's going further into this. He's going to dissect deeper what it means Maila Mata that we've been discussing. The language is a little interesting because he says, "V'hine b'ini ma'alamata, man nikra ma'alamata." Like In other words, in this thing of Mailamata, what I mean to say, what is the meaning of Mailamata? That's the way it's literally translated here. So it's not usually written that way. Because he could have just said, okay, the Tzena Lem is that what he's basically saying is in the inyan of Mailamata, we need to understand what does it mean, Mailamata. That's what he means here. I think it sounds almost like he's quoting a language of another Maimer. Because he's saying, like, not a quoting of Maimer, it's like saying, in this inyan of Mailamata, you could also skip the words Tzena Lem and just say Mavur b'Mokamach. The inyan of Mailamata, it's explained elsewhere. But he's like almost explaining what means in the inyan of Mailamata, meaning to say, what is the meaning of Mailamata? So he's almost like, it's not just in the inyan, it's also answering a question.
More specific.
Yeah. But the question, why is he saying it in this type of language? I would have to see if this lashon is in a different maimer from the Tzemach Tzedek or the Alter Rebbe. Okay, Mavur b'Mokamach, and anyway, in this thing, what is Mailamata, explained elsewhere, Shezeu b'Bchinas Ribui Miyut. That this is in the levels of Ribui, the B'chinas Ribui means defined by Ribui more, abundance, and Miyut less. What's the opposite of abundance? Diminished. Okay. The Zesha Mismayat Ha'er, that this thing, that the energy gets diminished, from level to level, Zel B'chinas Mata. That's the meaning of Mata. He didn't actually say this in these words before, but if you look on top of page Samachalov, he did say a little more, not just the top of, a little further. It says, what's Korav Yesa le'erein soshu b'chinas Maila shabei, had a b'chinas Maila. Chol ma shemisrachik miktzeo elyon, had a b'chinas Mata. See, like 10 lines from the top. 9 lines. So he did say already that which is closer to the top of the kav, meaning more energy, is the Maila. But he didn't say more energy. He said that it's closer to the top of the kav. But it was very apparent from the previous chapters that it meant ribui and miyut. That for example, in the head, the containers are very small relative to the torso and the body, and that's why it has so much energy. It has the mind and it has the primary senses. Okay, we have to see where he's going here, but he's clearly adding something here to this thing. In other words, so he's saying, so what defines mata, lower, when the energy is diminished? See, I'm trying to just understand what he's adding here, but I guess it will emerge as we learn this. So he's saying another 2 words. Going through words here. He said, so from Milo Mata is Ribui Amiyut, and now he's saying it's also the thing of Kiruv V'Nichuk. Kiruv V'Nichuk means close and distant. When you dissect this properly, you really need to remember that we're talking about something that we cannot see. So we have to define it in terms that we can relate to as much as possible. That's what he's doing here. It's really breaking it down into the exact definition of what means basically spiritual space. What does spiritual structure look like? The cosmic structure when you can't see it with your eyes, which is really the real structure of existence, not the superficial one. So kiruv v'nichuk, the bekarav meir ha'er b'gili yeser. When something is close, the energy radiates more revealed. The zer ribui ha'er v'agili, that's ribui. So he's defining kiruv and ribui comes together. That means an abundance of energy and revelation. But kol ma shemisrachik, and there goes misrachik. So misrachik, the more distance it gets, mismalam and mismayat ha'er. The energy gets hidden and diminished. So we have that. We have here Maila Mata. What means upper, higher, and lower? He's saying is more and less, which is also closer and distant. Basically from the source, and basically in the energy as it gets diminished. Right. V'zeu gam ken inya Maila Mata shebam shachas hakav. And this is also the Maila Mata that we discussed in the last chapter in the transmission of the kav. Let me just clarify one thing again, very, very important. This is all language. The kavanah, the purpose of chassidus is not that you get trapped in the language, but the language helps you understand something beyond language. It's critical. Like when you learn Shulchan Aruch and you learn laws of Torah, they're on the contrary. You need to know. If someone says, what's an Erev? Or what's a Shir Kazayas? You don't want to have an abstract definition. You need to know exact measurement. A Kazayas is like an egg, or a little smaller, or like an olive. Kazayas is like an olive, actually. But that itself, there's different opinions. Because halacha talks about shiurim, it talks about measurements, it talks about defined things. The shki is exactly now, and not a second earlier, not a second later. Zman krishma. Everything is defined by structure. When you learn chassidus, it's almost the opposite. The words are meant to help you understand something beyond structure. And this is a big mistake, I know, because when we learn chassidus, they teach chassidus the same way you teach Negla. Like you memorize, just like you memorize the Lama Tes Malachas, that there are 39 things you're not allowed to do, you memorize there's a tzaddik bein Rosh and 100 levels. It's good for information purposes, but not for understanding purposes. For comprehension, chassidus, when you say kav, you don't want to start turning the kav into a physical line. You don't want to fit it into your model. You want to use a model of yours to understand something that's beyond your model. I'm just saying it because it's very important to always relate to that. So the word kav is a word from the Arizal, based on Butzina de Kardonissa, different expressions of kav and the Zohar. But basically, a ray of light. A ray of light is not really a line. It looks like a line. It works like a line. So the idea of kav is just a word to use. How did God transmit defined energy into an existence that cannot contain the whole infinite light? So that's the word, why it's called kav, chut. These are words. I'm just stating that because it's important just to... Same thing here, you see how he's defining Ma'ala Mata. He's forcing you to go away from your regular. Regular, you'd think Ma'ala Mata. First floor, second floor. A building of 20 stories. Very simple, that's Ma'ala Mata, that means higher and lower. But that's not correct at all. When it says the God came down on Har Sinai, it came down from higher to lower. What did he come down from? He was in the sky. So obviously there's something symbolic of coming actually in the Har, because physical Ma'ala Mata doesn't discuss that here. It evolves from spiritual Ma'ala Mata. But really we're talking about as God descended from one state of consciousness to another one. Which would be similar to, let's say, a teacher revealing to you something he never revealed before. It was there before inside of him, but you never saw it. So he's taking it from higher to lower. So it's really forcing us to really rethink the way we understand parameters.
Same thing as Malach Tofur Shanos.
Yeah, it's exactly the same thing. And Alpayim Shana Kod M'Teir Leilam. I mean, these are for sure, but Lashon B'nei Adam. But in truth is, that's what he said earlier. If you remember, he said about Atzilus that the Alter Rebbe would call Atzilus Elyon, the Eibishter. When you say Eibishter, you know what Eibishter in Yiddish means? The one above. Eibishter, the Hechster, that Eibishter, the one above. Because above meaning above us, superior to us. And I'm just spelling it out. So now he's saying this Ma'ala Mata that we just defined as being Ribui and Miut, more and less energy. Kiruv and Nichuk, closer or more distance. This is also the Ma'ala Mata in the transmission of the Kav, of the line of energy. Which is the Inyan, Ma'ala Mata in the Kav means closer and more distant in the flow of energy. As he says in Move Sha'arim, is the Arizal's book, he referred to it earlier when he spoke about the Eitz Chaim, on the top of Samach Aleph.
That's probably the Eitz Chaim.
No, it's not. Eitz Chaim, Move Sha'arim, and Eitz Chaim are like three books very similar. Actually, the Move Sha'arim and Eitz Chaim we had earlier than Eitz Chaim. So, but Eitz Chaim is considered to be more fundamental. More.
They're all Reb Chaim Vital.
Yeah, they're all Reb Chaim Vital. Notice the name, Eitz Chaim, Eitz Chaim. Move Sha'arim is also Reb Chaim Vital. These are like the Move Sha'arim is basically the beginning of Eitz Chaim with variations. Some things are spelled out a little more there. That's why he quotes from there. But they all talk about the Tzimtzum and the Kav. That's the beginning of these books. They're less popular today. You don't see them because you have the Eitz Chaim. But Chassidus, obviously, the Alter Rebbe brings Mov Sharim, Eitz Chaim. You'll see Eitz Chaim also. Like in L'Kutei Torah, the end of Vayikra, L'Havin, Masha Koz B'Eitz Chaim, the end of the Tzimtzum. So why Eitz Chaim? Why not Eitz Chaim? I think Eitz Chaim was also more nafutz. It was just more around. The truth is that Rebbe Rashab writes that the most reliable of the writings of the Arizal are the Shmoyin Sha'arim, which weren't even really available. That's why in Tanya, Eitz Chaim is far more quoted than the Shmoyin Sha'arim are 8 gates. Shar HaMitzvah, Shar HaPsukim, Shar HaKavonis, Shar HaYichudim. Yeah. Reb Chaim Vital, the primary writings of the, when you say Kisva Arizal, is Reb Chaim Vital. He was the main transmitter, like Rabbi from Rabbi. He was, and he writes in the beginning of his Chaim, he even writes, he takes an oath to anyone that you're not allowed to learn anything else from the Arizal except him. He's the only one that has the authority. Now there was a Talmud of the Arizal called Rabbi Yisrael Surug, who left Tzfat and went more to Europe, to Italy, who had Talmidim like the Mishnah's Chassidim, the Italian Mekubolim, a lot from Rabbi Yisrael Surug.
Which Mekubolim?
The Italian ones in Italy.
Italian.
Like Mishnah's Chassidim is one, another is the Emek HaMelech. So that's almost, it has elements in Kabbalah that Rabbi Chaim Vital did not write. And in a way, Rabbi Chaim Vital is essentially saying, you're not allowed to read anything but me, meaning them. But the Rebbe brings clearly that that once the Alter Rebbe and the Rabbeim bring from Mishnah's Chassidim, that Tzemach Tzedek writes, and Emek HaMelech, I'll give you an example. Shashu HaMelech Batzmusa is only from Emek HaMelech. The Rishimu, talk about the Rishimu left after the Tzimtzum, is from Rabbi Yisrael Sarug. You don't find it in Eitz Chaim. The point I'm making, however, is the Rebbe has footnotes and says that once that Tzemach Tzedek writes and the Alter Rebbe writes, Tzemach Tzedek writes that Mishnah Chassidim, you can rely on it because the Alter Rebbe brings it. So bottom line is, they in a way have transcended Reb Chaim Vital's prohibition, and therefore that parts of the Arizal are also cited. And the Rebbe spoke about it a few times. There's the thing also made in Nevuchim. The Rambam writes in the Hagdama. The Rebbe wrote in Lamed Ches. The Rebbe spoke a sikha about this. That the Hagdama made in Nevuchim, the introduction to God of the Perplexed, the Alter Rebbe says also takes a vow. No one should read this except those that are Nevuchim, and yet we read it. So yes, there's the Shemer Amunim. Yosef Irgas, Rabbi Yosef Irgas, has a Shalat Tshuva about this. Halacha Dika Shalat Tshuva also about the Rachav, how we could have, broken their vow. Basically, Matan Neder. There's swearing about this.
The Shemer Amunim was also Talmid Arizal.
Yeah, Talmid Gurei, they call him Gurei Arizal. So he was already a Talmud of the Talmud.
This whole entire thing was not with the Ramak.
It says Chassidus says befeir Haramak lo yodam inyan hatzimtzum. As they state.
How could you understand it without a tzimtzum?
There's whole Maimorim on this. It's not right here. There's a whole section in Ayin Beis on this. Later he talks the whole thing about the Ramak. It's discussed in Chassidus. Ramak. It's not for here. It's not for here.
That's Arizal's Kiddush.
But once you see it in Zayar. It's hinted to in the Zayar. You say B'reish Aminos Demalka. You have expressions in Zayar. You have that once that is Megalit. It ends up being B'reish is Bar Elikim. Elikim is the Midas HaTzimtzum. But you don't read it until. That's a whole other discussion. What the Tzimtzum and how the Ramak and other Mukabalim understand Achdus Hashem. There are limits in how they understood it. There were big problems. Is that Arizal Tzimtzum that allows us to have Achdus Hashem, that their interpretation of Achdus was not quite the same way. It's to do with all the opinions about the energies being shaped, the Kalim. We learned before that Ramak says that the 10 hidden spheres are only the containers, not the energies. It's connected to this. Anyway, so that's Mavisharim. Hainu, the Bikitseo Ha'elyon, this means that in the Bikitseo Ha'elyon, in the top part of the Kav, Shu B'chinas Kiruv El Mekere, which is the level that is close to the source, Meir Shama'er radiates the energy Begila Yeser in a more abundant, revealed fashion. V'kol Mashanimshach Misrachik Mimekere, and the more it extends and transmits and gets distant from, moves away from its source. Mismayit to misalam me'er. The energy gets diminished and concealed. If you look in line 2, he said misalam or mismayit. Now he says mismayit to misalam. Just interesting distinction. There he says it gets concealed and diminished. Here it's diminished and concealed. Which when I read that, I thought it should say diminished and concealed sounds more correct. First you diminish something, then you conceal it. So, but on line 2 he said concealed and diminished. I'm not sure why, but that's what he said. Interesting distinction. You could say it's not really a diuk here, he's not really trying to emphasize that, but still.
He's saying chul in both of them.
He says chulu everywhere. And Lamed Zayin, Yud Lamed Zayin, the Rebbe speaks about the Rebbe Rashab style. Chulu is everywhere. And the Frierdiker Rebbe, when he would take quote Maimorim of the Rebbe Rashab, he would take out the chulus, physically cross them out. Which means that it was like a Rebbe Rashab's Ayin. Chulu really means that there's more. There's a lot more to say. He says every 3 lines you'll see chulu. Look how many chulus there are. The Rebbe spoke about it. He didn't explain why. He just said. Now he's giving an example. And like an example, in the flame of the light of a flame, or also in the light of a torch. It's interesting, oigam, meaning a flame is probably a better example, but you could also say this by an avuka. Shebikiruv meir harbe. Then when you're close to it, shebikiruv, close to it, it shines abundantly. The reason he's saying avuka, because avuka is stronger. So you could say being close to it or a little farther is not so much difference. But the truth is there's always a difference. And distant, let's say you're farther away from the flame, it doesn't illuminate as much. Even though it's the same energy. And there again he changes the order. Yet again. Only when it's distant from its source, it gets concealed and diminished. Interesting distinction. Every time he uses Gashmi's dikir, Ma'lamata, like not in the Kav, he uses Misalim and Mismayit. By the Kav only he said Mismayit and Misalim. Maybe that's the distinction. Because the first 2 lines also, it was still in the Moshel. He didn't yet say the Kav. He said Ma'lamata in general is concealed and then diminished. Here too he's using an example of a flame. He's saying it's concealed and diminished. By the Kav he used the opposite. Okay. Or b'moshla agashmi hu shenichla in the parentheses yad, and in the physical example hu shenichla ha'ir. He's distinguishing, even though he just gave an example. The example is only relevant as far as distance goes. Close, more light; distant, less light. But in the now he's qualifying and saying in the physical example, however, the reason for that is because as you move away distant, nichla ha'ir, the energy actually gets more extinguished. Nichla, weaker. This is not possible, God forbid, beruchnis and spiritual. The only thing that's possible there is that it gets concealed, which is the concept of being diminished.
In Gashmias, what is nichla when you're going further?
No, it doesn't mean that. He means, about pashtus, he means that as time passes, the flame will burn out. So, I also thought, first of all, I thought that he's saying nichla, meaning when you're distant from a flame, when it's burning, it's not because the flame is slowly burning out. So 2 things I want to say. Maybe what he's saying is that he's saying just a distinction, just know that Lamaila, the flame never burns out. It just gets diminished as you go down. The same source continues to flow. Here, it does, in the physical world, just that one distinction is that the flame gets weaker. So you could argue, now I'm adding a second point, you could argue, since the flame gets weaker, that's why the more distant you are from it, the less of it you have, because it's fundamentally a weak state. Lamaila, that's not the issue at all. It's a strong energy. The reason that it's this distant, you don't get so much of it, is not because it's a weak light, it's because you are on lower level, and you're supposed to get commensurate to your level. Like let's say the students. One student gets a diminished flow of intelligence, not because the teacher is getting weaker, or a teacher, God forbid, is because for this kalim you need to have a diminished energy. But you could argue, why is it diminished in one person? Is because originally the flame is not such a strong one. So when you're more distant, not that technically the flame is getting lower, but let's put it this way. Let's look at a physical flame. It's shining brightly. So when you're close, you see it very much. You go, let's say, 10 feet away, a little less. 100 feet away, you'll just see a drop. And you go very far, you won't even see it. Okay. When the flame starts getting weaker, what's going to happen? The one that's 100 feet away is going to stop seeing it. The one that's 10 feet away is going to still see it. So you see that it's somewhat connected to its own level of transmission. What he's distinguishing here is that Lamaila has nothing to do with it. Lamaila, it can continue to burn at full intensity all the time, and yet it continues to get diminished in lower levels. It's a very important qualification in that context. Okay. See what one parenthesis can do. V'zeu ma shekosa be'etz Chaim, and this is what it says in Eitz Chaim. He's now going to repeat the Eitz Chaim that he said on page Samach Aleph. So I guess he's really elaborating. Samach Aleph, let me just look back, I just want to make sure. Yeah. Look at this. It's almost a repeat of like line 15 on page 61. Not line, more than 15. 4, 7, 10, 15, 16. Yeah, line 15. So he says like this. So, Shezehu Mashakos Be'etz Chaim. This is what it says in Eitz Chaim. The B'chochma Meir Erin Sof B'kiruv Mokim. That in Chochma and wisdom, the divine infinite energy radiates close proximity. Proximity is also a good word. Proximity. Ubabina B'richok Mokim. And Bina radiates distant. And Samach Aleph he said Keser and Chochma and Bina. And here he's going to move on also now to Zoh. Continuing Eitz Chaim. Ubezoh, Zohir Ampin, which is the Midas, Chesed, through Yesod, Derech Halein, is like through a window. Ubemalchus Derech Nokov. And a Malchus is like through a hole. Like a peephole. Through a hole. Obviously these are all metaphors. So you have 4 ways that energy can reach somebody. You could be close to it, you can be distant from it, it could be coming through a window, like through a window, it could be coming like through a wormhole, whatever you want to call it. A nekev. A nekev is a hole, right? A pierced hole. So you see here 4 levels of gradation, a hierarchy. What does this mean? He basically just explained that we talk about Milo and Mata, we said is Ribui and Miut. Hierarchy, higher and lower is more and less, and close and distant. So he's now explaining all the close and distant thing.
They're not equal. Close and far, window and hole must be same kind of.
Yeah, exactly. The b'chachma me'er er begiliyeh. So what does it mean? Chachma, you have b'kiruv mokim. It means that the energy radiates there more abundantly, more intensely. U'kamoy al derech mashal, like for example, ba'askolas eze seichel, in the conceiving, in the comprehension, in the conceiving of any seichel, of any idea, or not conceiving, ba'askolas, in the understanding, in the comprehension of any idea, any seichel. Hari benekudas ha'askola, the chachma me'er er seichel begili er rav. In the point of Haskalah, of the concept, the way it's in Chochmah, the air, the energy, the intensity, the seichel, the energy of the seichel, radiates there, illuminates there with a gili erav, a very intense, a very powerful light. We said this earlier. Hagam she'enim musug adayin esa inyan sichli echomahu, even though in this nekuda, in this point of Chochmah, the idea is not yet understood. Eich, what? Eich, how, uma, and what is it? How and what? Because it's just a concept, but it's the concentration of energy. Nevertheless, it radiates there in abundant fashion. Which means this Nakuda of Chachma has it within it concentrated an enormous amount of energy, which later can be fleshed out. And when this concept, this nakuda, this point, then manifests and comes into comprehension of bina, where you flesh it out and the details of havana comprehension, mismayat, the energy gets diminished. In other words, the seichel gets diminished. The seichel. Even though the primary comprehension of it is in bina. So here you see something interesting. The comprehension on our terms of the concept is more in bina. Yet the intensity of the energy is more in chokhmah. The chokhmah, gamshi, gamken yediyah, mekomokim ein hasoga. Chokhmah, because even though chokhmah is some form of knowledge, some form of awareness, you can't call it faith, a concept, even though it's just a pure dot, it's a pure point. You just got an idea, you can't, that's not faith, that is a concept already. Nevertheless, you can't call it comprehension. That's why we have millions and millions of ideas fall into our minds, and many of them we don't comprehend, many of them don't even go anywhere. It's just
This is even more of a chokhmah, it's more connected to you, but it's not a soga. Soga means that...
Right, comprehension. And it's an interesting exercise that I would do if I was doing this with, like we were doing an exercise here. I would ask you all to write down later today, distinguish what is a nakuda of chokhmah. You know?
For example?
No, it actually happens to you. Because usually you'll find that when it happens to you, you're not even aware of it while it's happening. Because the whole idea of chokhmah is this flash. It's a spark. It's almost like an unknown, a mysterious thing happens. When you begin to become aware of chokhmah is when you're already getting it into bina. So the interesting thing is so the flash of an idea, like I just had this flash of an idea to suggest this suggestion while we were learning this. But now it's no longer a flash. I'm ready to discussing it. How many ideas don't go to the next stage? So it'll be an interesting exercise. That's why it's hard even to talk about chokhmah. Because as soon as you talk, it's already bina. It's already not chokhmah, if you know what I'm saying. But nevertheless, chokhmah you can see has an unbelievable concentration of power. The fact that an idea can have that you can just come up with a new concept is. But I'm saying this is words. We talked before about language. You have to learn to understand chokhmah and bina are not two same things, and one is a little higher than the other. It's a completely qualitative, two different entities. They work differently. Bina is a kalim oriented force, and chokhmah is a oriented force. Chokhmah has a drop of keli, like he says, it's a nakuda. But like in mathematics, a point and a line is the difference between infinity and finite. A line is finite and points are not.
Bina must have the chokhmah.
Of course. Yeah. There we go. So, we'll give it up. So even though seichel is also yediyah, chokhmah, is also yediyah, but kol malkum ein hasaga, nevertheless you can't call it comprehension, kol moishi zbar, as we shall discuss. The inyan hasaga hu bebina dafka. The idea of comprehension is specifically in bina. And nevertheless, in chokhmah, the revelation is more intense, more abundant, more powerful than it is in bina, as we discussed. As we discussed earlier, chapter 33. No, I'm sorry. Let me reread that. Nevertheless, in Bina you still have a strong, a expansive radiating of this energy. Because in the mind in general, Chachma or Bina, there's a radiating energy. An idea, a concept has a lot of energy in it. A lot of light. Mashenk and Bizarre, now he goes to the third level, Zoyer Ampin, which is like the Chalein, that a Chalein, Now the energy is already beginning to radiate shine through a veil. But it's a transparent one. What? Yeah.
Why just skip? I guess that's
Does not go in the structure. So there goes into this. Once it's coming through a window, it's already more diminished. What do you say? There's a glass that's opaque, and there's a glass that's translucent is see-through.
Light comes through.
Right, and opaque is
Transparent. You can see through, and opaque, nothing goes through.
so what's the difference between transparent and translucent?
Light comes through in translucent, but you can't see detail. You can see there's light.
Okay. But chalein would be transparent. Yeah, bepashtus.
Yes.
Because it's not yet. Or kamal derech moshel irashem is like, for example, the light of the sun. Outside of a house, outside of a home, the sunlight radiates expansively everywhere. In the whole area, the whole span of space. But in a house, which of course has walls, and therefore conceals the sun, it only radiates through the windows. It only shines through the windows. Because the walls cover the sunlight, the light. And there's not. So outside, where there are no impediments and no obstacles, the sun just shines. You have unfettered sunlight. As soon as you get into a house, the sun is shining through a particular area, which is the windows. It does not radiate bisachvus expansively inside the house, only through the window alone. Because as such, the light is more diminished from the way it's outside of the house. So you have the same sunlight. You don't have a tzimtzum on the sunlight per se, but from the perspective of someone inside the house, you have it in a far more diminished form.
Intensity.
So let's say you're sitting right here. So yes, sun would come through the window. Besides the fact that you could put a window shade up, well, let's not get into that. But the sun right here is not going to be with the same intensity as when you walk out the door. That's derech halein. That's what he's explaining. It's yet a lower level. Remember, he spoke midas because midas in chapter 33. He said midas is about yesh, about me, what's good for me. So as soon as those containers are more intense, which is in this case like the house, you're now, which is actually a house, is you. When you're outside, there's no you there. It's not a private. You're a private entity. You're a reshus hayochid. So when you're there, therefore the energy itself is diminished. I'm just pointing that out. That he explained that earlier. Here he's explaining the Eitz Chaim. He wants to explain the idea of space, spiritual space, spatial, conceptual space. So these examples are just examples for how to explain that. Eitz Chaim. So that's chalein. ולכן אומר רז"ל, אכסדרה לעירה נבדקת מפני שהעיר שם בריבוי מהשנקן הבייס. And that's where Razal say Achsadra, which is a porch, right? You do not need to have. I think this is about the checking for chametz before Pesach. That you don't need to have a candle because you could check it if it's still daylight. You could check it because it's outside. Whereas inside the house, you need an air because you can't go into every corner and see. So it's a clear example, halachically, to what he just said. Because Achsad is outside, so you have basically the daylight, sunlight. Meaning to its light, you can check through the light, the natural light that's there. Because the energy, the light is there abundantly. Mashenkin habayis, mashenkin, but in contrast to the house, where you don't have that natural light. The same thing is understood. The bezah kishamei rak derech halein. It's also understood that zoy rampin, when the energy radiates, the light energy is rak only through a window. Has a b'chinas miyatair. It's in the form of diminished energy. What he's adding, I believe now, is not just that within the house you have less energy. What about the sun coming through the window itself? It says derech halein. If you look at the Eitz Chaim is not talking about the house. The Eitz Chaim is saying that the energy is coming through the window. The sun coming through a window, if you're standing right near the window, it's almost as much as it's outside. So I think he's going to explain that even there it's diminished compared, which is obvious as well. Let's see what he says. He's going to give an example. Or maybe I'm not right. I'll see in a moment. Like an example, an example he's giving now is a psak din, a ruling, a legal ruling that comes after the extensive pilpul, the extensive back and forth, extensive, how would you translate pilpul? Hashing out, extensive arguments, discussions, bekama time with different reasons, visvaris, and arguments and theories. In the final ruling, in the legal ruling, you don't recognize the reasons and all the arguments back and forth. Only thing you recognize there is that this is the ruling and that's it. Now, obviously, a judge may write his reasons, but we're talking about the psak itself. The psak says, you win, you lose. Or, this is the ruling. There, in the psak itself, you don't see the whole background of the intensity and background of the ideas. That's what he's saying. And we must say, and we have to say, that in concealed state, you have it within the psak, within the final ruling, the entire arichas, the entire discussion. Because the ruling didn't come out of nowhere; it came from this whole extensive discussion. So you have to say that it has within it, the psak that is, the legal ruling has within it all the reasons and the arguments. Only thing is, they're concealed and they're not recognizable in any revealed way. Like the Mishnah. In the Talmud we have the Gemara consists of Mishnah, which the Tanoim taught, and then comes Gemara that explains the Mishnah, the Amoraim. The Mishnah is a kitzu sheba achar arichos. The Mishnah is a summary that came after a lengthy, elaborate discussion and dialogue amongst the Tanoim, amongst the teachers, the sages. So the Mishnah is a summary of that, a short summary. That means after the lengthy discussion that was by them, by these teachers, Tanoim, this whole subject matter, time with many reasons, visvaris and arguments, upilpul, and analysis, the pilpul gadol, great analysis. All this comes in the Mishnah in a very concise fashion. And then afterwards, in the Gemara, in the Talmud, the idea is developed and expounded and expanded upon. We also discussed before Mishnah and Gemara. This example was used. If you remember, the second example after letters, just interesting for comparative purposes. Remember the example here on page. I believe it's on page 39, chapter 25. Am I making a mistake? Is it elsewhere?
I don't remember it in those days. I remember in the store, reduction in the Ayin Beis store, the Gavana, but I don't remember that discussing that.
Hold on. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it is earlier. For some reason I thought it was in that chapter, but the Mashpia. Okay, it could be that wasn't there. I do remember that this was brought earlier. Maybe my Shmai Vavtalia, that where?
Could be. That idea of the idea didn't come into weakness.
Okay, I have to find it. I do remember that before the Mishnah and Gemara were brought. Okay, I don't see it right now. So, something we need to look for. I'll find it. Unless it was later in the later chapters. Okay. Anyway, not relevant. Sorry about that. And the Gemara, this becomes expanded and expounded upon. All this is he's coming to explain what it means that the energy, the light, comes to Zah through Chalai, through a window. So let's continue. And therefore somebody who's a Chacham Gadol, a very wise person, from the short, summarized, concise language of the Mishnah, in brief, in brevity, in brief words. Yedeya, who Eskol Harichas, he knows the whole Harichas, the whole length of the discussion. Ubamishnu behelim. And in the Mishnah it's concealed. But he can see it because of his wisdom. Like the din, he's giving an example now of a psak. A sukkah that's taller than 20 cubits, psula, is not kosher. That's the din. Now if you build a sukkah that high, it's not kosher. And there are reasons for this. Because higher than 20 cubits, that high, a person doesn't live in that type of space. B'tzel sukkah. Or another reason, or because when something is so high, you can't see it. Huh?
Don't notice it, right?
What?
Don't notice it.
Right.
You know, the back.
You don't notice it.
You don't notice it.
So since a sukkah, since a sukkah has to be ka'in, Pesukah's teishvu, ka'in taduru, meaning like in a home, people don't live in homes of that size. So sukkah, that's the first reason. The second reason is because you don't notice it. These reasons have different elements to them.
This is so funny. You know, this is almost like Tamsi Sabina. And you say that the Sak Din comes in is the conclusion of all the story. It's almost like Tamsi Sabina. So the light should be very powerful. And the mashal of the Halal.
We didn't even finish.
I understand. But the mashal of Halal is...
But we didn't finish, so...
Let's finish the question. And the mashal of Halal is less light. That was just my comment at this point.
Okay. So these reasons that he just gave here, when you see the din that the sukkah is puzzle, higher than 20 amma, higher than 20 cubits, all you know is the final ruling. You don't know the reasons. You don't know the differences between the reasons. Why this reason, why that reason, all the different arguments. So everything is there. Everything is there in the summary of the Mishnah. The only thing is, it's concealed. Now he's going to explain. Now this is the mashal. For who and this is the meaning of the diminishing of energy, of light. Even though it's there in a concealed way, it does not radiate in any revealed way. Now what is revealed? Is the sound going all right there? And what is revealed? Is a level of diminished light. Same as with intellect and emotion. That emotions, compared to meichin, in contrast to intelligence, are diminished light and revelation. Like in a contemplation, a meditation on a divine concept, through which you awaken and arouse a love and awe. What radiates, what shines from the mind to the heart, to the emotions, is only a very small bit, only the tip of the iceberg, only an edge. But the reflection of the energy must be within the emotions. Because if not, without it, there wouldn't be the awakening of these emotions. And this reflection, which is in the emotions, has when it concealed the whole length, the whole extensive meditation. But it's in a form of diminished light. The same thing is above. That in Bina, the energy radiates, illuminates extensively. And in Midas, Zohar Ampin, Rag Derech Halein, only like through a window. In a diminished, in a level of diminished energy, light. So let me elaborate. Huh? He says diminish, miyut. Okay. So the question is like this: what did he add to this whole piece here? He gave an example of the sun in a house, sunlight outside, unfettered, without boundaries, without any blocks, without any walls, and inside a house. So midas, that's what we have. We have a diminished form of energy because it's within the house. In Zoh. Then he gave the example for it, because obviously the example of the sun is just an example, a physical example. What is a conceptual example? A conceptual example is an idea. So you have a verdict, a legal ruling, a verdict. You only have, that's what he says, derech halein. What you're seeing is a diminished form of energy in this final verdict that's not revealed. So when you go outside, so to speak, when you go back to the Bina level, you'll have, that's Bina. Bina is comprehension. We're not talking about Chochmah now. Earlier he spoke that Chochmah is the Nekuda, is a point that is the most intense energy. Bina is already some containers, abundant containers, substantial containers, and therefore the energy is diminished. Then there's a Nekuda Satamtzis. After Bina you come to some summary. You come to a summary where he said that it has some of the Chochmah within it, but not quite. Because it ultimately is now, as he says, morgish. It's tangible, has some type of sense. This was in chapter 33. Okay. It's possible to say that the psak is the tamtzis. I would say psak is even more than a tamtzis, because tamtzis would be a summary of all the ideas. That would be like someone who collects and gathers all the ideas and gives you a summary of the arguments. That's a summary of arguments. Psak din is even further than that. Psak din is maybe das. I'm not sure. But psak din is bottom line. It doesn't matter. The bottom line is psak din doesn't even have a summary of arguments. That's the point. Psak din is just the result. The result is kosher, not kosher. You win, you lose. Who's the winner, who's the loser? Within that lies the whole argument, because you wouldn't get there without all that whole process. You wouldn't get to midas without the bina, the meichen, without the intelligence. But when you look at it right now, the end, you only see what you see. So you see what you see is diminished. It doesn't mean it doesn't have within it the intensity. That's the example he gives. Then he uses the example. That's one example. Then he uses the example in Aveda Meichen and Midas, that the midas that awaken from your mind is somewhat like the psak din, is what he's really saying. It's somewhat of a result of a process, that the result only has a diminished elements from that process, though it's in there concealed. And it wouldn't have been possible to have this next stage if you didn't have the source. It's not some new entity. So it's basically, from a perspective of we're not talking now the mile of a psak din. A psak din, of course, has a big advantage because you could sit and have pilpul all day and not have a conclusion. We're not talking about that now. We're talking about purely from a perspective of energy, revelation, consciousness. So there, the result has within it's concealed. So that's what he means. Zoh is derech halein, because you have the energy coming in, but it's coming in a diminished form, like sunlight coming into a house. So obviously the example is not complete exactly, because when the sun is inside through a window, it's not exactly like a psak din. But the point is, all these different examples illuminate different elements of the idea. So that's what midas are. Over malchus, then comes level 4.
Just to take away message that midas are like the sunshine through the window?
I wouldn't say that, because you're going to get it's not. No, why does that help?
No.
If it helps in understanding it, the example of remember, it starts with the Eitz Chaim. Zoh, the light the Zoh is like coming through a window. The example means like sun coming through a window. So you know that it's a diminished form of light. Now, what does this mean conceptually? Conceptually, it's the idea of a legal ruling that comes after a lengthy dialogue or discussion. So technically, yes, but I would not put it quite that way. It doesn't make any sense. Like a psak din is like sun coming through a window. Why would you say that? How does that help? The only thing that's relevant is that it's diminished and it's coming from somewhere. In poetry, you could do that. Then comes. You want to ask something?
Yeah, he does explain the idea of Halam using the Sakdin, using the mission Sukkah, using the idea of making meters, but still it's hard to tie into the Mashal Halam. It doesn't.
What Mashal?
The Mashal Halam, Mashal window. So that's the light, but I guess we're only targeting the light.
The sun is an example. Just why he uses chalein. Chalein is a mashal. It's an example. It's an example of diminished light. The sun inside the house somewhat helps understand why the Eitz Chaim would use the word window. Like what is a window? So sun coming through a window, like inside the home, it's diminished. That's that. Even if he didn't use the word chalein window, you could explain midas compared to meichen with everything he said here. But he is explaining the Eitz Chaim, so it's within that. At the end of the day, Zoh is a diminished energy compared to the mind. Chalein is the example used. That's all. It's not an explanation of the word chalein. There's an explanation of the diminishment, the conceptual diminishment. Yeah.
You said in the mashal of the sun in the window, as the sun being that.
Yeah.
You said the sun would be somewhat chachma, equivalent to chachma.
No, not at all.
The light is.
I would not do that at all, because chachma, he already moved away from chachma. Once you say expansive light, you're talking about bina. The bottom line is, what is this from math? You're talking about from. Why would you want to do what you're doing? Why are you trying to create? Why are you creating such a physical? It's all conceptual. Sun is just an example for the diminished energy. That's all that matters here. The reason chalein, because in Kabbalah you use words that help understand, words that help give us examples, but the point is to abstract it from the example. That's the end of the day. You're not trying to. There are no windows in heaven. It's like you're talking about divine energy. There's no window. The windows, on the contrary, windows we have. Next time you look at a window, it should remind you of Zoh. Not that Zoh should remind you of a window. That's what I would say to you.
Alright.
You understand?
My intention is to understand more about the physical, through the physical way to understand it.
The physical chachma, the example he gave for chachma, he gave earlier. He gave different examples that when you understand a concept, you have the intensity of the concept there. I would not carry this through because in chachma and bina, the expression is kiruv mokim, richuk mokim. You're close to the flame or not close to the flame. You could use the example: are you closer to the sun or more distant from the sun? But that wouldn't work because there's no such thing. The sun is too powerful. So there's no such thing as being closer or more distant to the sun. That you're going to have more light or less light.
I mean, there are certain places on the planet that are colder or warmer based on how.
But you should know it's nothing to do with distance. It's to do with angles. Summer and winter are not based on distance, as people misunderstand. It's based on the angle.
Well, the Earth itself isn't further, but there's certain parts of it that doesn't.
So you want to force the muscle into understanding Chachma Bina? If you want to do it, do it. No, I mean, listen. That if something's not understood, we can elaborate. What's missing here? That's the question. I think it's relatively understood. And a malchus, the light, the energy comes like through a hole alone. So now he's going to explain what is this. Like example, like someone now who reveals his feelings, is chalein compared to richuk mokim, distance, window. Now, when someone reveals your feelings in speech, you communicate, you express your feelings. Like someone who speaks words of love. Or because of love, that's why he's speaking. Because he loves this person, that's why he's speaking. That's why he speaks with him. Interesting two ways of interpreting that. In other words, one is that you're actually saying I love you, or saying words of love, so you're expressing an emotion. Or, because of your love, that's why you express yourself. You love someone, so you speak with them. You can speak to them not words of love, you can speak to them and say, hey, breakfast is ready. Speak to them and say, the sun is shining. But it's coming from emotions. We're not talking about superficial. That's the key. Because again, remember, the key thing in all these levels is that even as it's diminished, it's still the original energy. Like, we're not talking about some new entity. It's just a matter of shtalshlus here. He's talking about structure, ma'ilo mata, to understand the structure, the hierarchy, but not yesh ma'ayin. We're not talking about a new entity creating some new thing. So it's just the same energy flowing in different stages and different levels of revelation. Just for the record. That's why this is critical here. So these two types of speaking. This speaking reveals the emotion of love. Because, first of all, they express love, or because the words are coming from a loving place, are a result of love. Because when you hate someone, it's the opposite of expression. Interesting way of putting it. In other words, you wouldn't speak to someone that you dislike. This itself needs analysis. Why not? You could yell at them. You could tell them you hate them. But obviously that's also an expression of an emotion. So why is he saying it this way? I'm not really sure. I guess. Because it's a pasuk. Okay. Who's the person you hate? Someone that you don't speak with them. That's what he's bringing here. Okay. And nevertheless, even though it is an expression of love, or expression because of love, what it reveals is only a reflection of the emotion, of the love, which is obvious. He's bringing a proof, and the proof is that when you are in the intensity, in the throes of your excited emotions, or let's call it ignited emotions, you can't even speak. Only when that emotion is diminished, concealed, you can speak. And in those words radiate just a reflection of the emotion. This is all an example for Malchus Derech Nakov. That the energy comes, the light comes through a hole. Same thing, the level of Malchus, Shemeir Ha'er B'tzimtzum Amid B'chinas Nakov Levad. Same thing, Malchus, which is Dibur, the energy radiates in a very... So Malchus, which is Dibur, they radiates the energy in a diminished, a tzimtzum, a concealment, and diminished way, just like light that shines through a hole. So think of the window as giving you the whole sunlight. How much sunlight is getting through a little hole? So all this is an Eitz Chaim is using examples, and Chassidus really. So which is an explanation to which? Is Eitz Chaim explaining Chassidus or Chassidus explaining Eitz Chaim? I would say Eitz Chaim is explaining Chassidus, because Eitz Chaim is really a marshal for this idea. Malchus, what is Malchus? Malchus is communicating emotions, which in effect is really the emotions that are diminished. That is, the example for that is light that comes through a hole. This itself can be used into an application of how we communicate in relationships. Because I know people who don't communicate at all in relationships, so there's no light coming at all through the hole. Then there are people who communicate, who the light is coming too extensively without the right proper measure. Okay, so all this is now, he's now summing up the whole discussion. Remember, this all began in the beginning of the chapter. The beginning of the chapter was what? That Milo, Mata, higher and lower in the spheres and in the structure, the spatial, the conceptual structure of existence is higher and lower, which is more and less, Ribui and Miut, more and less, which is Kiruv and Richuk, which is close and distant in the Kav. And that led us into the Eitz Chaim, which was this whole explanation. What does it mean that Chachma, the energy, radiates? Kiruv, close, Bina, distant, Za, Midas, through a window, and Malchus through a hole. So he explained all that in all the levels of it. So now he sums up. And this is the meaning of the hierarchy of higher and lower, above and below of the 10 spheres. That what does Maila mean? Extensive, abundant energy, much energy, that's higher. And diminished energy or light, is lower. That's why Chachma is called higher than Bina. Not because it's physically higher, because it has more energy. Because in Chachma and wisdom, the light energy radiates in abundant fashion. And this is what we say, Moichin, intellect in general, is Maila, is above emotions. Because there radiates more energy there. But when you say that the energy and the light is equal in all the spheres, like I mentioned earlier, even though they can be distinct, they're distinct entities and fundamentally distinct, each in their own level. Chachma, Bina, Chesed, Gvura, and so on. And that's the meaning of Rosh and Seif. Something is a beginning, something is an end. That doesn't necessarily mean higher and lower. Rosh and Seif could be that there's there's a Rosh, Teich, Seif. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. This doesn't necessarily mean this could be, this is horizontal, not vertical. Right? So you could have a horizontal structure but no vertical structure. Many ways, Ma'ila Mata is vertical structure. Ein Zeh b'chinas Ma'ila Mata. That's not. So even though the spheres are separate on their own, and they can have a beginning, middle, and a beginning and end horizontally, but vertically, again spiritually vertically, there's no higher and lower. There's no hierarchy. You'd say Chachma and Bina have the same amount of energy, but Bina is in a Bina form. Chachma is another form. Here we want to establish not just that they're distinct, but they also have hierarchy, meaning they also have a higher and lower element to it. So basically, horizontal structure would be distinction, and vertical structure would be abundance of energy, or the level of energy.
And both are present?
They both create the structure. Yeah. He's giving an example. Like when the keches atzmim are revealed, when the essential faculties of a person are revealed, like during a simcha, for example. He used this example, if you recall, by sefirot agnuzis. He said these words, that when they're revealed the way they are, chapter 22, they cannot come into the world. And he gave the example of his galus, that his keches hagluyim, the hamshachasim is with kedima ve'ichur. There's a beginning and an end. There's a structure. Ishtalshalos, remember? But when the hidden keches are revealed, chapter 22, page 35, there's no structure. It all comes out flowing, all equal, as one equalizer. Just comparing the two. So here it's called keches atzmim. So even though intellect fundamentally is higher than emotions, so when the essential, because the eir hanefesh, the soul's energy radiates in them in an equal way, there's no higher and lower. So even though one is fundamentally above the other, but on that level, when they're in their essence, so to speak, when their essence is revealed, you're not going to see a distinction. Which is why you don't have, like when a person's intoxicated, I mean in a good way, there's a certain lack of structure between, midas can come out with full intensity, there's no that whole gradation, you could speak a lot more than you would usually speak. The same thing, an example above. Like in the world of Teyu, of chaos. So in Teyu there's spheres, but because it's chaotic and there's no structure, there's no normal order of above and lower. Like it sells elsewhere. Interesting contrast. I thought he was going to bring Ezra sefirot agnuzis, because that would seemingly be a better example, because the root of the spheres, not Silas, where they are manifest in containers, if it was a revelation from the sefirot agnuzis, from the keches atzmim, like he said, like I just said in chapter 20, what chapter did I say it was? 22. Chapter 22, there's no structure. That's seemingly more consistent, but he uses Teyu, which is really a distorted structure, not just an atzmistic structure. Just pointing that out. I guess Teyu would be a more example of the contrast, just to show you how crazy, how wild it would be. But l'chayda, the example of Esses Rizanuz would also fit. If the Eiris and the not in Kalim, and we're just coming from like Etzem and Nefesh, they would all come as equals. Yeah, that's what they are. And Esses Rizanuz, as we said, they're all equal there, because they're all in the vision of the artist, so there's an equalizer. Even though he wants distinction, but they're not yet distinguished, they're not distinct. Just pointing out why he uses Teyu. It's a good question. But anyway, it's an example for it. So there we go. So bottom line is that the structure, both horizontal and the vertical structure of Ma'ila Mata, of higher and lower, is determined by the level of energy that's flowing. Ribui Emiyat Ha'ayah, like he says. Okay, let's do the summary. Kitzur v'hine ma'ila matu inyan ribu yomit. And now ma'ila mata, above and below. Hierarchy is the idea of ribu yomit, more and less. V'sibosim hu akiru v'harichuk. And the cause for that, why it's more energy and less energy, the cause for it is because of their closeness or their distance, as he explained with the kav. So now he added that Kiruv Arichuk is the cause. Before in the actual chapter, he just said this is also the idea of closeness and distance. Here he's saying the cause for more and less is closeness and distance. Very interesting. It's additional touch. The Ribu Eir Vagilu B'chinas Ma'ila, where there's abundant energy and revelation, that's higher. The Hel Mamita Eir B'chinas Mata, and the concealment and diminishment of energy, that is lower. Helam and mute. He says again, Helam first and then mute. Okay? That's why Chochmah we call higher, and superior because of its abundant energy. Like the point of a concept, the energy is abundant, and the comprehension it gets diminished, concealed. Here again, he reverses the order. in the same summary. First Helam and Miyat, now Miyat and Helam. Nevertheless, in Bina it's still expansive. In emotions it gets even more diminished. Like in a legal ruling. Or like in a Mishnah. All the elaboration is concealed. And in speaking, even the emotions are also concealed. So in emotions, only the arichas is concealed, only the elaboration. In speaking, even the feelings are concealed. An essential faculty, with energy there, the light there is equal, even though they have a beginning and an end, a top and a beginning and an end, as I said, horizontally. They're not vertically, they're not higher and lower. And that's how it is in the world, in the spheres of Teyu, where the energy is there. There's a ration safe, they have distinct entities, but they're not in the form of a structure of higher and lower. Everybody wants to dominate. Ano emlech, I rule, as he said. I guess maybe that's the reason he brings Teyu, because it's more of a...
It's interesting. It's in the Kav. The Kav doesn't affect it within the Oven and the Kudos. It doesn't really give a amount to the spheres at that point. Not too much later.
Okay. So let's stop here. Now what?
At that point, the Kav doesn't affect the spheres of Tohu to give them Ma'av Mata.
Who said that?
That's what we're saying here. The Kokos Atmim of Tohu are on the same level. They're all like Kokos Atmim. There's also a product of the Kav. The Kav doesn't affect them with the Ma'av Mata in the particular structure.
Why not?
It seems to be not. Is that incorrect?
I wouldn't say that and put it quite that way. The question is why the Kav doesn't affect them.
Yes. Okay.
No, that's a question, but it's not for here. He's going to discuss. That's.
He's just discussing how there is Ma'av Mata.
Yeah.
Immediately comes in a certain area of Kav there is not Ma'av Mata. So that seems to be the question.
No, that's a good question. The bottom line is going to come down to is because there's an imbalance there of Eris and Kalim. In other words, the Kav creates the structure. In Atzilus is where it manifests properly. Before Atzilus, there's imbalances. Like even Akudim, they don't even have yet containers. But that's another. So there's no Mailamat either because there's no containers altogether. There's only one container. So in general, there's no Mailamat. In other words, Mailamat does come as the energy starts settling into the containers. Remember, in Esesphere Segnuzis, as I mentioned, there's no Mailamat either. The Mailamat begins after the Kav, right? Yeah. So anyway, the bottom line is in Atzilus, that's where it manifests in the perfect structure. How the distortions he doesn't discuss yet. He just was most important was to define how the structure does work. So let's stop here. We did chapter 37, pages 62 through 64.